Fleeced, Chapter 14, Scroll on a Roll. An hour later, Alex and Aries were sitting at the table in Dr. Pottersby's Weir's cramped kitchen, waiting for Rose to come back from the Royal Geographical Society. Only the day before, Alex would never have let the scroll, tattered and useless as it was, out of his sight, and particularly in the care of a girl. After all, it was their only divine help up here. But sometimes in life, there are situations that convince you to trust people quickly, and someone helping you to defeat a harpy in the British Museum is one of those situations. Alex knew that Rose wasn't like any girl he'd met in ancient Athens, but more like the Spartan girls he'd heard of, brought up to be strong and athletic, to ride horses and chariots. He'd been impressed at how she'd stood up to the harpy, even if she hadn't really known how to do it, but more than that, he'd been touched that she'd helped them. After all, Hades only knew how fantastic their story must have seemed to an Earth girl, and so when she'd suggested she'd take the scroll away to fix, he'd agreed immediately, happy to follow instructions not to leave the house or answer telephone. Of course, since neither Alex nor Aries knew what a telephone was, that was hardly a problem. The sound of the front door opening shook Alex from his thoughts. "Did it!" called Rose, stepping into the hall. She pushed back her hood and hurried into the kitchen, grinning and holding the scroll up triumphantly in front of her. Now, since Rose wasn't the sort to blow her own trumpet, allow me to tell you that she's done a wonderful job. Really. Of course, she'd always been pretty good at fiddly things like holding Brazilian lizard dung between tweezers for her mother to examine, but this time she'd excelled herself. Having charmed her way into the building, not hard, since most of the people who worked there still remembered her father, she'd nipped into the map lab during coffee break and used the machine to patch the scroll's holes so neatly that they all but vanished. So, let me say it again. Well done, Rose. Which is what Alex said too, as he set down his mug and unfurled the scroll, only he didn't sound nearly as excited as me. In fact, he sounded subdued and rather nervous. Quite apart from all the strange people and things he'd seen since arriving, he'd been thinking about being attacked by a harpy, and he'd just reached a very unpleasant conclusion, which we'll come to in a minute. "Brace yourselves. It was easy, really," said Rose, trying to sound cheerful despite their anxious faces. She sat down beside them at the table. The machine calculated that the scroll dates from around 440 BC and told me where to find the parchment to repair it with. I used some stuff unearthed at Corinth years ago, fed it into the machines, and it made all the right pieces. She touched a scratch on her cheek. "So I suppose we can ask it who sent that bird thing to the museum." "We don't need to," said Alex, biting his lip. "Only Medea is powerful enough to create a harpy up here on Earth." "But why?" Aries dropped the breakfast bowl he'd been tipping towards him to finish off his tea. It clattered in the stillness. "Why is she sticking her big nose in?" "It wasn't big," said Alex. "Not in the wedding portraits they sent me to paint on the commemorative pots." "Perhaps she's still got it," muttered Rose, thinking out loud. "Got what?" said Aries. "Her nose?" "No," said Rose. "The fleece." She turned to face the other two. "Think about it," Rose went on slowly. "Didn't you say that neither she nor the fleece came down to the underworld?" "That doesn't mean she still has it, though," said Alex. "Not when it's been more than 1,000 years since she helped steal it." "But why else send a harpy after us?" said Rose, "unless she's scared that we'll take the fleece away from her." "Scared?" Alex suppressed a nervous laugh. "You think Medea'd be scared of a couple of kids and a ram?" There was a mumble from the direction of top of the table. "And a scroll," added Rose quickly. She turned to look at the roll of paper, flipping its corners sulkily. "Perhaps we should be asking it questions instead of sitting here puzzling our heads off. We've still got 3 left." At which point the scroll unfurled with a shimmy. "Thank you, Rose, said down to you. I'm again a scroll ornately. My dimples now are veiled smooth and flatter me most greatly. 3 answers left have I to give, so pray ask me sedately." Twisting round, it shot a teaspoon onto the floor and flipped open and shut excitedly. "What's the question?" Alex took a deep breath. "Scroll, we want to know, does Medea still have the fleece?" The scroll remained silent. "Please," added Rose. "Thank you, Rose," muttered the scroll. "How nice to find someone with good manners." It huffed and rolled out taut. "The fleece has brought Medea dark hoards of wicked riches, and swapping wands for needles means her powers in the stitches. For with the fleece the sorceress doth conjure and bewitch us." Aries frowned. "Alex, is it saying yes or no?" Alex watched as the scroll tweaked its corners up into a papery smile. "It's a yes, I think," translated Alex. "I knew it," said Aries, clattering the stone floor with his hoofs. "That's why she's scared of us. She knows we're coming too." At which the scroll snapped shut. "And a no," added Alex. "Probably." "Make your mind up," sputtered Aries. Rose reached out her hand and stroked the scroll. "I think it's telling us that it's a yes and a no." "Yes, she still got it," said Aries, "but I wonder what it meant by the no." For a few moments everyone thought while the scroll purred contentedly against Rose's hand. "What about her powers in the stitches?" said Rose, but no one had any ideas about that either. "Swapping wands for needles," Rose persisted. "All that." "Scrolls," decided Rose, "even repaired ones, were nowhere near as useful as the internet. You couldn't just type in your search word and wait for a clear answer to flash up." The scroll rustled impatiently. "Do you have another question?" "Hardly," muttered Aries sourly. "Not when you've already been so helpful." "I'm sorry," the scroll replied, "but I may give you only the answers which I distill from the psychic vibrations around me." "I'll give you psychic vibrations," muttered Aries. He looked up at Alex. "What should we ask now?" Alex swallowed. "The only thing we can ask." "Scroll," he said. "Please will you tell us where to find Medea?" "Well, whilst they're waiting for the scrolls to tell them, I can tell you precisely where Medea was, sitting in a ruby-winged back armchair in the living room of her London house, scowling. And scowls go, it was an especially vile one, a real face crumpler, compounded of annoyance at Miss Dementor, who now trembled in front of the sorceress, and of the sickening stench that seeped up through the room's floorboards from the cellar below. Despite the bowls of fresh lilies Medea set around the room and the flickering sandalwood candles, nothing ever masked that putrid smell. And what, you might ask, was down there making such a stink? Well, ask away, because I'm not saying anything about that place until I really have to. Medea stood up and fixed the harpy with her pale silver eyes. "I can't believe you failed to bring me the ram." Hex, who'd been snoozing on the back of the chair, now opened one sleepy eye to see the sorceress pluck a black rose from the vase on the mantelpiece and slap it against her palm, sending showers of velvety petals to the floor. "Well," Medea turned back to the harpy, who sank her scraggy neck low into her chest, "do you have an explanation?" "Mistress, I didn't expect the ram to have such help." "Help?" Medea's voice rose. "You're talking about children." "Yes," the harpy went on nervously, "but the boy was so protective of the ram and the girl, and she was so determined and resourceful." Medea raised an eyebrow. "Really?" She thought for a moment and regarded the harpy darkly. "How old was she?" The harpy shrugged. "About 12? Hex noticed a dark smile cross Medea's face. "Useful, mistress?" "Perhaps," said Medea in a voice that sounded like ice cracking underwater. "And I found out something else," added Miss Dementor quickly. "She told me her mother works at the museum, a Dr. Pottersby Weir." Medea frowned and walked across the room to check the morning's newspaper and flicked through the pages until she found what she wanted. "Dr. Augusta Pottersby Weir. Here we are," she said, reading over the article with fresh relish. "She's the woman who's going to fix the carriage, due to fly out to Greece this morning." The harpy lifted her chin brightly and began preening one foot with the other, even though she was wearing boots again. "Is that useful too, mistress?" Medea shrugged dismissively. "It hardly makes up for your failure," she muttered, "but you won't let me down again." "No, mistress," said the harpy, making a half bow. "I promise No," Medea cut her off. "You misunderstand me." Raising one arm above her head, she whispered something under her breath and twisted round in 3 full circles, whereupon a flash of red light shot from her fingers, bounced off the ceiling and pierced the harpy's chest like a thrown spear. "Mr. The harpy gurgled and slumped to the floor, her eyes black circles of pain. "Ooh," said Hex in the twitchy silence that now filled the living room. "Don't you think that was a bit harsh?" Medea glared at him. "Do you want to be next?" Snapping his head back faster than a party blower, Hex ducked behind the chair and laced himself tightly against its carved fretwork as Medea swept past. She stooped to pick up the black smouldering dragon's tooth from the rug where the harpy had stood and slipped it into her pocket. For a moment she stared into the cold embers of the fireplace. Then, closing her eyes, she whispered a name under her breath. A moment later the door behind her opened and someone, or rather something, tall, broad-shouldered and immaculately dressed in one of Medea's suits for gentlemen, clopped inside. Clopped because although the creature's head and torso were those of a man, his hindquarters and legs were those of a goat, bowed furring beneath those pressed trousers and ending in polished brown hooves. The creature was a fawn, the second of those Medea had created in Regent's Park the night before. Now stepping into the sunlight streaming through the window, his black hair, smooth as gloss paint, twinkled almost blue. A microphone headset curled neatly around one ear. Beautifully groomed, he might have passed one of Medea's own fashion models, save for the two horns that poked through his hair. "Pandemic," said Medea. "At your service, mistress." The fawn bowed and straightened up, smiling, making his face crease into lines around his deep brown eyes. "I assure you, your problems are at an end." "You'll bring the ram to me," said Medea. "Without fail, mistress." Opening one beautifully manicured hand, he revealed a set of panpipes. Their long reeds glinted in the firelight. "The old ways still work," he smiled. At which Hex slithered over the back of the chair and onto its seat for a better look. "Don't you think he's a bit weedy?" he muttered, looking the fawn up and down. The fawn raised an eyebrow. I think you mean svelte." "No," Hex regarded him, hissing. "Definitely weedy." "Which is why I've created reinforcements," said Medea. "Reinforcements?" said Pandemic, his voice rising peevishly as a second figure shuffled out from behind him. Thick-set and lumpen, he looked rather like a gorilla bundled into a dinner suit. It stared back at the fawn with a single watery green eye, set squarely in the centre of its lumpy forehead. "Dear Fred," Medea brushed a fleck of soil from the creature's jacket. Pandemic wrinkled up his nose, disgusted, as Fred began flexing his muscles, making them squirm like octopus tentacles beneath his sleeves, whilst his knuckles crunched like pistachio shells. "Not bad," she murmured, smiling. "Now some of you might be wondering why Medea had created such odd-looking helpers. Why not employ a vindictive vet, or a sheep wrestler? Well, think for a moment about who is sheep's worst enemies. Yes, I do know I sound like a teacher, but go on, humour me. Dogs, dingoes, coyotes and wolves, the local butcher with his special offer on mint sauce and a glint in his eye. Good answers, but all completely wrong, because sheep's worst enemies are, in fact, 1, fawns, 2, cyclopses. All right, harpies too, on account of their talons, beaks and penchant for lamb chops, but we're not including them here, since the only harpy we've come across on Earth is now an ex-harpy, recently turned back into a tooth and gathering fluff in Medea's pocket. Pandemic, being a fawn, was a relative of Pan, the shepherd god, who loved nothing better than terrifying flocks into frenzies by tooting his panpipes until woolly-doolally they leaped off cliffs and dived into rivers. And Fred was the great-nephew of Polyphemus, the Cyclops from whom Odysseus and his sailors famously escaped by strapping themselves beneath the bellies of the Cyclops' sheep when he released the flock from his cave. This meant no sailors to tea that night and a whole race of Greek monsters that forever hated sheep. Consequently, Pandemic and Fred represented the top-of-the-line, hoof-curling, wolf-razzling nightmare for any sheep, and more precisely, one particular ram. "But Pandemic began. "Ram, blurted Fred. "If you don't mind," interrupted Pandemic. Ram, Fred continued happily. "I have always," Pandemic tried again, raising his voice, "felt that brains are far more use than—" Fred poked Pandemic in the chest with a banana-sized finger. Ram, Pandemic bristled. "Mistress, must I really take this oath with me?" Medea pursed her lips. "That oath is the brawn you'll need if that feather-brained harpy was right. I can't risk another mess-up. So, sort your differences quickly." Her eyes shone like wet slate. "Need I remind you that failure by either one of you will mean punishment for both?" She plucked the tooth from her pocket and turned it slowly in front of them. "Understood?" "Understood," muttered Pandemic. Said Fred. Medea turned away from them and looked out of the window into the long-walled garden, its coppery bricks bathed in sunlight. "Miss Dementa said the girl's mother worked at the museum. Find out where she lives." She looked over her shoulder, glancing at the walkie-talkie on the table beside a chair. "Then wait for my instructions." Chapter 15. Uptown Ram. Medea's made a patch of grease with magical power. Now her house basks in an olive grove in swankiest Belgravia. But stay out, 'cause like flies in webs, inside there's naught can save you. Oh dear, flustered the scroll. "I'm sorry about that." "About what?" said Rose. "The y. It's hardly proper English, and I do have my standards. However, you wouldn't rhyme with Belgravia and y, would?" "Get on with it," muttered Ares. The scroll sniffed and went on. "Beneath those marbled corridors, in darkness vile and creepy, the mournful cries ring out in fear. lamenting long and weeping. Keep out, whatever you do, especially you, bald sheepy. Bald sheepy, spluttered Aries. The scroll blew what sounded like a paper raspberry. Rhymed with weepy, it said, and snapped shut. I wasn't too keen on the bit about mournful cries, said Alex. Or the lamenting, added Rose. She leaned forward, frowned at the others. I wonder what it means by a patch of grease and olive groves here in London. As directions go, they're pretty woolly, aren't they? Do you mind? Muttered Aries. Sorry, smiled Rose and rubbed his forehead. Aries stretched towards the scroll, put his mouth round its end, rather like playing a bugle, and boomed down its middle. That answer was fit for the rubbish pits of Attica. Please elaborate. The scroll quivered angrily. I am a scroll of godly assistance, the gift of Athena. Consequently, do not expect me to function like a common or garden London A to Z. But an address could really add to your last answer, coaxed Rose. Let me see, replied the scroll, and wobbled over to Rose. As a matter of fact, I do feel a secondary vibration coming through it on this point, it murmured unfurling. She works in Bond Street, seemed desires, her store for wealthy girls, to sew her skirts of harsh regret in sequins, silk and pearls. Seek there for next to bolts of cloth your answers will unfurl. No way, Rose scrambled to her feet. It can't be. Can't be what? Said Alex, confused. I know her. You know Medea? Said Alex incredulously. Well, sort of, Rose nodded, running her fingers through her hair. I mean, everyone knows her. She's only the most fabulous dress designer on the planet. Dress designer, said Alex. Rose sat back, blinking. She makes amazing clothes for people. I can't believe that she kept the same name. Rose paced across the kitchen, counting on her fingers. She's in the papers. She's on the covers of Glossy magazine. She's all over the web. The web, said Aries. We know about that. You do, said Rose. It's made of ropes, said Aries confidently. Actually, Rose said gently, it's something on a computer. More like a magical library where you can find things out. Hang on, I'll show you. She had hurried upstairs and returned with her mother's laptop. Flipping it open and began searching Medea. Alex and Aries watched wide-eyed as Rose clicked on a picture and the sorceress began walking across a red carpet on the screen in front of them. She goes to celebrity parties, she meets presidents, she's like everywhere, gabbled Rose. All over the world, posting outside grand hotels and theatres, standing next to famous people who wear the clothes she creates. She turned to face him. The scroll must be wrong in its answer, she said finally. No, said Alex, his voice little more than a whisper. That's her. But she seems so nice on the telly, protested Rose. You know, all fun and giggly, and she's really pretty and everything. It's just crazy, like finding out that one of your teachers is actually a member of the royal family or something, which we all know is true. Aries nudged Alex. Why is she so surprised? Don't know, said Alex. Deceiving people is what Medea does best. Yes, said Aries, and she's not very honest either. Rose fought back. The scroll said something about sewing skirts of harsh regret in sequins, silk and pearls, repeated Alex, whatever sequins are. They're round, sparkly things, muttered Rose, distracted, like stars but made of plastic. She began pacing again. Harsh regret. I wonder what the scroll's trying to tell us. Who knows, grumbled Aries. What it told us was to seek answers in her shop, said Alex, which sounded much safer than going to a house in Belgravia. I don't like the sound of that place, said Aries quietly. Nor me, said Rose, rubbing her neck gently. Besides, the good news is that I happen to know where her shop is. Alex brightened. You do? Sure, said Rose. Bond Street's not far from here. It's in London, said Alex. Rose nodded. Ooh, squealed Aries. I'll be back in my fleece in time for dinner. What are we waiting for? Hold on, said Rose, looking into his eyes. If you're going uptown, there's something we need to do first. And now for a soupçon of geography. Do you like that word? I do so. I shall say it again. Soupçon. It's French, you know, and means a little bit. Now, the soupçon of geography that concerns us, and more importantly, Alex, Aries and Rose, is that soupçon is the soupçon that tells us that Bond Street lies off Oxford Street, one of the busiest thoroughfares in London, probably the world. Busy, that is, in terms of shoppers, tourists and workers, not busy in terms of runs. In fact, you hardly ever see one there at all, which is why it left Alex and Rose with a problem. I look a complete idiot, muttered Aries half an hour later, catching sight of his reflection in one of Selfridge's windows. On either side of him, shoppers and tourists surged past, businessmen barking in mobile phones. Not at all, said Rose, stroking his neck. You blend in perfectly. And she was right. You see, Rose had strapped a couple of light white boards either side of Aries' body, fixing them so that they tented over his back like a rooftop, and had painted on a slogan, Don't miss out like me. Choose Harrods, the best sheepskins in London. so that now he looked like a walking advertisement. Clever, eh? Having already passed a woman dressed as a frog who was advertising beer, and a couple in a purple pantomime cow costume, complete with a ringing bell, who were advertising Swiss chocolate, everyone simply strode past Aries and the children, believing a bald ram to be yet another wacky advertisement walking down the street. Not that Aries saw it that way. Well, he wouldn't, would he? However, he wasn't the only one in disguise. Rose, having rifled through her mother's wardrobe, was now wearing a floppy sun hat, blue floral dress and green flip-flops. Alex was wearing a pair of Dr. Pottersby Weir's sunglasses, an ancient pair with round circles of black glass with tomato red frames from her hippie days, and a baseball cap backwards. After all, it's hardly wise to walk into a sorceress's shop looking exactly the same way you did when you sent a harpy to attack you a few hours earlier, is it? I still don't like it, grumbled Aries. I mean, could you imagine Achilles riding into Troy like this, looking down from his horse with a "Hello, Hector, nice day for a fight. Thought I'd wear my best wooden tent for the occasion." Only because Achilles wasn't as bold as you, Alex told him. Aries looked at him suspiciously. Well, Alex began, who'd believe that the world's most important ram would ever be dressed like this? Most important ram, said Aries, brightening. That's right, added Rose, exchanging a knowing glance with Alex. Only someone as truly noble as you are could carry it off with such flair. Aries drew himself up taller. Well, I suppose when you put it like that, I am being rather clever. And so all three walked on, content and relaxed in the knowledge that for the first time in public, in London, Aries wasn't the centre of attention. Tourists and street cleaners, buskers and backpackers all bustled past without a second glance, and I expect that you might be sitting back too, thinking and taking a deep breath and thinking, thank goodness for that. Well, don't. Because when I say everyone, I'm not being strictly truthful, since I'm not including the tall figure in the unseasonable trilby hat and his squat, lumbering companion, who hadn't taken their eyes off Aries and the children from the moment they'd stepped out of Rose's house and had been following them ever since. And whilst we know who they were, Aries, Rose and Alex didn't, which meant that they weren't the least bit troubled by them. Yet. Medea's shop shone like a pearl, framed by lavishly carved pillars that were topped with gold-painted leaves. Its sign, picked out in gold and turquoise mosaic, twinkled in the sunlight. On either side, luxury shops stretched away. Jewellery shops glittered with conker-sized sapphires. Cafes served Hawaiian coffees. Auction houses groaned under the weight of portraits of Georgian ladies in marshmallow pink dresses. But of course, all this swagger, together with the shop's enormous price tags, meant two important things. One, you'd never find a children's writer shopping there, unless it was that really good one who wrote about the boy wizard. And two, they are simply not the sort of establishments to welcome rams through the doors, no matter how famous, noble, or important to ancient myths they are. And so, Rose, Alex and Aries had no other choice than split up. You will be careful, said Alex for about the 15th time. They're standing in a small public park just around the corner from Bond Street. Black railings and froths of fiery red, that flower I can't say, bound its clipped lawn. Two wooden benches faced each other over a green-looking pond, noisy with frogs burping in the shade. Of course, said Rose, pushing back the brim of her hat again. I'm only going to walk in there. Checking Medea isn't round first, interrupted Alex. Rose nodded impatiently. And have a mooch round to see what I can find. I'm not sure, said Alex. It feels too dangerous, which, frankly, it was. But Rose was adamant. Of course, as she'd explained, she was the only one of them who could walk into Medea's boutique without raising suspicion, or in Aries' case, the police. But what she didn't explain, because she'd have felt far too silly, was how much she wanted to walk in there and help them. Not because they were the most amazing friends she'd ever made, although they were, or the only ones to rescue her from a Greek monster, ditto, or even because of that last question on the scroll, although thinking about that felt like fireworks exploding behind her ribs, but because whilst they couldn't have been more different from her, she hadn't felt as much in common with anyone for years. She understood how Aries felt on losing the most precious thing he'd ever known, because she had too. She understood Alex's loyalty, how he'd come to earth with Aries, even though he was clever enough to know it was probably hopeless and certainly dangerous, because she'd risked just as much to find her father again. Consequently, she wasn't about to let her new friends down, and let's face it, if you're not prepared to stand up to an immortal sorceress, your mate, what sort of friend are you? What's that? One who isn't snatched up by Harpy and cracked like a nut? Okay, I suppose you might have a point. Rose unfastened her watch and handed it to Alex. Look, if I'm not back in 10 minutes, come and find me, okay? Alex turned the watch round in his palm, staring blankly. "It's a watch," said Rose patiently. "Use it to tell the time." Alex and Aries exchanged blank looks. Rose smiled and took the watch back. "Just count up to 500, she said, "then come looking." Rose shivered. She'd walked the street loads of times, and in the past it felt magical too, but in quite a different and much nicer way. Now it felt strange and unfriendly, and standing in the shadow cast by Medea's shop, her heart thumped against her ribs. Worse, she felt that eerie sensation of being watched. You know, that prickly feeling on the back of your neck when someone is standing close behind you. Being a sensible girl, she put it down to the trio of mannequins standing in the window, petulant as prom queens, posed with their hands on their hips. The way they seemed to glare down their long noses was frosty enough to make anyone feel uncomfortable. Each wore a black wig and a simple black dress brightened by belts in different colours, one red, one silver and one green. 3 jackets, one red, one silver and one green, were laid along the bottom of the window, together with a blue one, each threaded into wire around the mannequin's feet, so that they rose like petals of jungle flowers. The sort of jungle flowers that poisonous toads make their homes in, thought Rose with a shudder. Taking a deep breath, she walked towards the door and took hold of the golden handle. Pushing the door open, she glanced back at the mannequins and jumped. Had their eyes moved? She stared at each hard face in turn, feeling frightened and silly, and reminded herself that they were only made of moulded plastic and as harmless as lemonade bottles, which I think, given who opened the shop, was just a tad optimistic.